siccome un angelo in terra pellegrino, fresca siccome Giglio che s'apre sul mattino, occhio che poi.
Hey everyone. Last week we took a look at what is arguably the epitome of the golden age of opera buffa, Italian comic opera in Rossini's The Barber of Seville, which we here at San Diego Opera will be producing in April. Just to remind you, we took a look at the early antecedents to the characters in Barber, all of them directly related to Arlecchino, Dottore, Pantalone, and others whom Italian audiences got to know through the traditional Commedia dell'arte. Commedia troupes traveled throughout Italy between the 16th and 18th centuries, improvising satirical plays in the piazzas and the courts of all the important cities. Members of these troupes were not simply actors. They were acrobats, singers, musicians, jacks of all the theatrical trades. And each member of the troupe would specialize in certain of these stock characters. There were a number of plots called lazzi that these guys would learn, outlines or skeletons for the improvised plays, and some of these plots are as old as the art of theater itself. The plot of the old man in search of a young wife who in turn loves someone much younger and much more appropriate for her, and who seeks help in avoiding the old man's attentions, was a favorite plot in these satirical plays. There was always something inherently funny or odd in the attraction of an old man to a young woman. The comedy was to be found in the inability of the man to accept his chronological age, of course, and for Italian audiences, far more earthy than our tame American audiences, there was the thought that the old man wouldn't be able to keep up, as it were, with the young woman's enthusiasms. That added to the comedy. So if you remember from last week's podcasts, the old man who was portrayed in this way was called Pantalone in the Commedias. He was usually a merchant or a tradesman who had lots of money but was quite unwilling to ever spend it. He was always presented as mean-spirited, stingy, and lecherous. The Simpsons' Mr. Burns would be considered a perfect descendant of Pantalone, although we can find aspects of this character in many contemporary films and TV shows. He functioned in these improvised commedia plays to be an impediment to the action, the one who would always throw a wrench in the proceedings, the one who would always stand in the way of the two young lovers, the innamorati as they were called. As we discovered last week, Bartolo is the Pantalone character in Rossini's Barber. In the opera Don Pasquale by Donizetti, Pantalone has top billing. Pasquale is Pantalone. Look at it this way. Pasquale is old, rich, and penurious. He's incredibly tight-fisted when it comes to his money, and yet he wants to take a young wife. Well, we know what's coming, especially when we meet the beautiful young widow, Norina, and Pasquale's nephew, Ernesto, who are very much in love with each other. At the beginning of the opera, Pasquale informs Ernesto that if he marries the penniless Norina, he'll disinherit him. At the same time, he expresses his own interest in marrying a beautiful young bride so that he can produce an heir that he can leave all his money to instead of having to give it to Ernesto. Now that's one mean, stingy guy. He's a perfect Pantalone in every possible way. Now, I'm sure you've figured out who the innamorati are. Yes, the two young lovers are Norina and Ernesto. But remember, Don Pasquale hasn't actually met Norina. He's only heard of her. So a plot's hatched to get him to marry her in a mock marriage, at which point she will turn into the biggest shrew he's ever met. She'll spend all his money, go out late at night with his nephew, treat him rudely, even abuse him physically, until he's so ready to get rid of her, he practically begs Ernesto to take her off his hands. How does all this happen? Through the machinations of the Arlecchino character, Dr. Malatesta. Remember Figaro from The Barber of Seville? Well, in every commedia there has to be an Arlecchino who moves the plot forward and helps the two young lovers get together over the difficult situations strewn in their path by the old man Pantalone. The Arlecchino character in Barber is Figaro. The Arlecchino in this particular plot is Malatesta, Pasquale's doctor. He arranges a meeting between Pasquale and Norina, whom he passes off as his sweet, innocent, convent-raised sister. Pasquale falls for her immediately, signs the false marriage certificate, and then all hell breaks loose as Norina's true character is revealed. You may well ask why I'm spending so much time on this plot and the Italian forebears of these characters in Commedia, and I simply want to say that there's an important point to be made here. That Italian operatic comedies that we've adored in the opera house for years and years doesn't just appear sprung fully blown from the minds of these composers and their poets, their librettists. In a similar way, the plots of our nightly situation comedies and popular movies that still make millions and millions of dollars for the film industry still rely on many of these commedia plot lines and characters. They're all very much alive, and we have them to thank for so much that entertains us inside and outside the theater. It's also important to know that Donizetti's Don Pasquale, although it is thoroughly Italian, didn't premiere in any of the great Italian theaters. It premiered in Paris in 1843 at the Théâtre Italien, a French theater but that specialized in Italian opera. It was also the last pure opera buffa in the 19th century and can be seen as the end of a long tradition that was finally succumbing to the more realistic, tragic operas of composers like Verdi and Wagner. Italian operatic comedies do come along later, works like Verdi's Falstaff, Puccini's Gianni Schicchi, but they're further removed from the commedia tradition, and they don't stick to the rules of opera buffa as they were set out by earlier composers like Rossini. It's hard to write comedy, and even harder to write comedy that's sung. So when you come to see Don Pasquale, take a brief moment to appreciate the centuries of comic development that preceded it and the historical and cultural context from which it sprung. I'm Nick Ravellis, and I'll see you at the opera.